Well, thank you very much. I have to tell you that I actually was looking forward to this year's convention, had planned, both Louis Pugh, our executive vice president, and I had planned to attend. Uh, I'm somewhat, uh, I'm not, I guess I'm honored to be asked to speak on the history. Uh, but I'm also somewhat well, I also should have to say that I'm not really an expert on the history of owner operators or trucking. I know what I saw in during my career, and I spoke with lots and lots of others that had been in this, that were long in the tooth when I first started driving. So, trucking has evolved through the years. Um, I suspect owner operators in one fashion or another have pretty much been around for as long as there have been trucks, and moving their own product primarily from agriculture, that those guys generally evolved into what was used to be described as exempt haulers, hauling exempt products. Those other owner operators that were leased to carriers, uh, my first awareness of how this came about was as a direct result of things that were going on within the Teamsters Union. And this would probably be in the '60s and into the early '70s. There were instances where Teamsters, uh, who team primarily the regulated industry was made up of just Teamster trucking companies, and there were instances where there would be local, I guess, locals, local unions around the country in various places that would sign sweetheart deals with various trucking companies where, and the sweetheart deal was it would allow management of that company to go to their drivers and say, if you want to keep your job, you have to buy your truck. And that that did go on. I don't know how prevalent it was, but I know it was. I know it happened at the time, and of course, those drivers more than likely were the first owner operators that were leased to carriers, and it's kind of evolved from there. In those days, most of trucking was regional, and it was regulated by the Interstate Commerce Commission, and most of it was regional. I'm not certain if there were any trucking companies in the country in those days that had authority to drive all over the country. Authority was granted by the Interstate Commerce Commission to run select areas, to haul specific select products, and it was even to the tune of they would prescribe what roads you could drive on, what highways you could drive on, and and it probably overseeing commerce, overseeing interstate commerce has always made sense for there to be a federal role. Bear in mind, ICC came from first the railroads, where there weren't many railroads, and some of the railroad operators were pretty selective about their customers and the services that they wanted to provide. And they didn't mind in those days discriminating against certain people for generally economic ends, but it was deemed at the time not in the public's interest that trucking was, trucking did need to be, and the railroads, commerce needed to be overseen to make certain that consumers, that people got the benefit for what it was all designed to do. And when I think back about the early truckers that I knew, uh, those that hauled, it was a very, very different, I'm going to say, for lack of a better word, I'm going to describe it as a far more innocent time, in that you could do a lot of things, you could get away with a lot of things. And it was an opportunity for entrepreneurs. And certainly that opportunity existed when I got into trucking. And I wasn't among the founding members of OOIDA, but I was one of the early members of OOIDA. And this is during a time where America had never really seen anything but pretty much economic expansion year after year after year after year. And our organization was formed as a result of the very first Arab oil embargo. And, which basically it created major obstacles for the country, and it created unbelievable obstacles for truckers themselves. And, I should have mentioned this earlier. Forgive me for pausing just a second, but, again, I don't characterize myself as an authority on anything. I've learned some things, but I'm always open to hearing from experiences of others that actually went through some of these situations and some of these times, and their experiences may have been different. And if anyone that's so inclined, feel free to jump in here, because broadening the perspective, there simply is no downside to that. So in whatever mechanism makes sense, jump in when it's appropriate, if you feel it's appropriate.
Todd, we have Tom Mullen has his hand up, so we're gonna unmute him. Tom, if you'd like to unmute yourself, you could ask your question.
Hi, Todd. This is Tom Mullen, president of ATHS. I just really want to thank you for all that OOIDA has done for the industry. And I'm really excited about the relationship that you guys have started to build with ATHS. So once again, I want to thank you for taking time to be part of this program with us today.
Well, I appreciate that, Tom. And again, I'm glad to. And, while it's been my observation that owner operators specifically are truck people, but they're equipment people. They take pride in everything they do, and it certainly gets in your blood. And and looking at equipment and looking at some of the older trucks that are out there and that are around that you all have, it brings back memories for me, certainly fond memories, but it also, bear in mind, the realization shouldn't be lost on anyone that if you were an early trucker, you had to be a hardy soul, because none of this stuff had air conditioning. Trucking existed for a long time before that power steering came along, and in lots of instances, you better know something about your equipment, because you may have to do a breakdown on the side of the road, or if something comes up, you better know how to change fuel filters and fix lights and things like that, because if you don't, you're not gonna survive. So, and looking back at some of the old trucks, God, they're so cool to look at. Would love to have them. I don't know if I'd want to drive 150,000 miles a year in one, though. It would really, they would work you. So, at any rate, and in terms of other things that I might say, again, feel free to jump in if anybody's so inclined, because broadening the discussion, there's no downside to that. But, trucking is not an industry that's ever attracted kind of the faint of heart, because you don't get into this business without, you don't get into this business unless you're willing to accept a challenge. And it's always been that way, and I suspect it always will be that way. Trucking has certainly changed through the years. A whole lot of it, it changed in more than ever after deregulation, after the ICC was disbanded and everything was opened up, it changed dramatically. But before I go there, let me just talk a little bit about OOIDA in the beginning. In that, basically, most of the owner-operators that were around in those days were either in the category of exempt carriers, meaning they hauled exempt products being unprocessed products, and that's going to be grains and timber, those kinds of things, raw unprocessed processed products. The other owner operators, the only other option for you would be to lease to a carrier on a long-term basis, and those were sort of came under the jurisdiction of the Interstate Commerce Commission, and of course, once you were on one of those kinds of leases, you either hauled what the company you leased to offered you, or sometimes you could trip lease, and there were provisions that allowed trip leasing, and generally many of those weren't so economically rewarding, but those options were there, and if you were creative, sometimes you could find a way to make it work for you. Certainly many truckers did. I did as well. And again, the world was a much more forgiving, innocent place then than it is today. But at any rate, when getting back to the creation of OOIDA, then there were truckers everywhere, and our only communication links were CB radios and things like that. But when oil prices started rising in the very first Arab oil embargo, something like that had never happened before in the nation, and truckers found themselves in a position where not only had fuel prices jumped dramatically, but truck stops were having difficulty getting fuel. And truckers were finding themselves in a position where when you got to a truck stop, if that truck stop had fuel, you might be limited to as little as 25 gallons. And in those days, it wasn't all that uncommon for trucks to get no better than 3 or 4 miles per gallon. So a 25 gallon fill up would get you just about to the next truck stop where you'd do it again. And if frustrations were going mighty high, they sort of spanned the country. The spark that sort of united truckers getting together was a guy by the name of J.W. River Rat Edwards. He was OOIDA's first president. He was a company driver, and and the story isn't totally clear whether frustration got the better of him or he simply ran out of fuel, but it was on a Pennsylvania turnpike and he stopped. And in those days, it wasn't uncommon if a truck stopped for other truckers to, stop to offer help. Well, some did, and they didn't. Pretty quickly they decided we weren't even going to pull off the road. So trucks started backing up and cars started backing up, and pretty soon the lanes were full and the shoulders were full. And this is when frustration really, reached the boiling point. And, again, I talked about things were different then. It was a much more innocent time. The things that drivers did in those days weren't even violating any existing state laws. So no one had ever stopped on a road before deliberately to simply block it, but it was happening then, and in Pennsylvania, and certainly it caught the attention of everyone. I mean, the news media, the local people, word spread among truckers. Similar things were going on other places. There were demonstrations at truck stops. PA Governor, I believe his name was Shapp at the time, uh, he obviously thought that he had to do something. So he came and met with the truckers and said, what can we do? What can we do? And of course, obviously fuel was the issue that basically launched it all. Quickly, there were lots and lots of other grievances that drivers had, legitimate grievances. And he said, well, let me see if I can set you up with a meeting with some people in Washington, D.C. to see if they can get some of these things worked out. And he did. He was as good as his word on that. And there were a group of truckers that went to D.C. to meet with lawmakers and policymakers, convinced at the time that if they could just sit down with the people that were in a position to change things in a day or two, all of the frustrations that drivers had at the time could be resolved and they could simply go back to work. Jim Johnson, OOIDA's third president, was among that group that went to DC. And they talked and they talked and they talked and they talked. And pretty soon they realized that the solutions that they were seeking weren't going to be all that easily resolved, simply because there were already established people in Washington, D.C. that would be impacted negatively by the things that OOIDA's early members were suggesting. And they weren't about embracing change at that kind of speed. So after about a week of those meetings, Mr. Johnson and the others left DC, and they were with the realization that the solutions that they sought would have to be, the only way they would be achieved is if there were people that were working on a sustained basis. You can't just, it's not a matter of wait till a fire gets going and then you go and put it out. You got to make sure that fire never gets started, or it doesn't get out of hand anyway. So at any rate, like, we've seen this many, many times, and, we're sort of getting a reminder now with the trucks that are in DC over what's going on with the economy and brokers and the inadequacies of some of our systems and the inadequacy of some of the regulations and the inadequacy of some of the enforcement of those regulations. We're seeing that now, but realistically, nothing has really changed through the years. If you want to see things change that are going to change to your benefit, you got to be there on an ongoing basis. But again, many of the things that happened in the 1970s, while most of the crazy things that happened are kind of fun. I mean, they're kind of funny and they're kind of great to look at in the rearview mirror. They were certainly educational on the part of those truckers that were involved, but also educational on the part of lawmakers. Again, this is in the 1970s, and Jimmy Carter was the president at the time, and there was an Interstate Commerce Commission, and there were lawmakers there that basically had sort of awoken to the fact that to the importance of trucking and truckers, and of course the industry itself was probably far closer together than any time since. Most of the trucking companies that existed at the time were private companies, and they were actually run by truckers or former truckers. And most of the trucking companies out there weren't great big ones like there are now, and of course there kind of was a common theme among many of the players then that basically, if things were going to really get better, things had to get better for the drivers. And lawmakers were interested, and there were hearings held by the small business committees in the Congress, and they looked at lots and lots of issues. They looked at certainly the regulatory scheme, but they also looked at things like loading and unloading. And, you know, believe it or not, I mean, loading and unloading has pretty much always been an issue for truckers. You know, the term that's currently used and still used today for what happens in loading and unloading situations, the term lumpers, I mean, that comes from situations where, common situations where drivers, and these would primarily be drivers exempt from ICC regulation that were hauling produce and other food products to grocery warehouses where you'd have to pay to get your stuff unloaded. And if you didn't pay, there'd be somebody putting lumps on your head. And that's where it comes from. And pretty common in the day. Now, at once upon a time, among our early almost successes was we had convinced the House of Representatives that there should be a law that simply said drivers shouldn't have to load or unload. It should be the responsibility of the shipper or the receiver. And we had that passed in the House. And of course, realistically, no, not much sooner than we got that passed, then shippers and others became aware of it, and they were able to kill it in the Senate. So, you know, we've never given up on that as a long-term solution, as a long-term goal, but realistically, there may be other ways to do it in the right way. Now, what we did get out of that is we did get an anti-lumping law that basically said it's against the law, it's against the regulation to force someone to pay for loading and unloading. Now, that doesn't mean that the shipper or the receiver has to provide it, but it does say they can't charge you for that. Excuse me, I just got a message that said, I suppose because of the weather here, my internet may not be all that great. So if I skip out on you, you'll know what happened. But at any rate, let me go on and simply say that, you know, it's been a goal of ours ever since then to continue that education of members of Congress, because there certainly can be benefits gained from that. Having said that, while, you know, again, back in that more innocent time where you could get away with a whole lot more, since then, certainly trucking changed with deregulation. The whole makeup of trucking changed after deregulation. Prior, the ICC would say basically who could haul what and where. After deregulation, anyone could get authority to haul anything anywhere. It was basically just apply and go with virtually no oversight whatsoever. And that exists today. And how the evolution of trucking is as a result of that, as I said earlier, prior to deregulation, most trucking companies were run by truckers. After deregulation, the evolution moved away from truckers running trucking companies, but you had MBAs, you had accountants, and you had attorneys that moved into running trucking companies. And they were built on with the notion of take these companies public, use investor money to expand, and they weren't necessarily interested in hiring experienced, seasoned drivers. They were interested in hiring right off the street where they could take people and sort of mold them into the image that they wanted. And basically, the whole idea was basically to expand, to expand margins, to grow, and again, the whole mindset that they approach trucking changed dramatically. We're still going through those growing pains right now, and we probably will be for a while. And where it all plays out, I've got to think. I think I've got to think it all ends up positive at some point, but the parties, the players, have to sort of understand that that we will make the best gains if we can work together, if we can find solutions that we can all embrace. And while you'd like to see problems be resolved once and for all, it's if we're going to see changes, and I'm going to say this is in trucking, but if we're going to see changes in our society today, it's going to happen incrementally. It'll happen incrementally, and they'll happen much, much quicker if we're all on the same page. But, getting back to some of the contributions that our organization has made, and, again, early on, OOIDA was all about truckers. It was created with bylaws with a board of directors that's made up of just simply truckers. And it was set up that way simply because so we wouldn't lose focus. We would always stay in touch with the people that operate the trucks, and primarily small business. Now, that small business can be owner operators, it can be small fleets, it can also be drivers for those fleets. For us, the issues are all that's most important, and certainly standing up for the rights of drivers has always been on the top of our list. And we've always tried to do that through, one, we try to do it through advocacy with policy and working through lawmakers, but sometimes those efforts come up short. And as when we talk about one of the downsides, or one of the changes that as a direct result of deregulation is, people would say that without some kind of oversight, these trucks are just going to run wild. And the government said, well, the government, and actually big carriers too, embraced the notion of, well, we can make sure that doesn't happen by boosting enforcement. And they certainly did that. In 1986, Congress passed what was called the Motor Carrier Safety Assistance Program. And I think it's kind of interesting that they call it assistance, because at the heart of MCSAP, the heart of that program was simply providing dedicated funding to each state where they could engage in commercial vehicle enforcement activities. And of course, we're not opposed to safety enforcement, but kind of the way that played out is you had what MCSAP did. It created this kind of group of specialists in commercial vehicle enforcement. And when I say enforcement, I mean, that's basically they enforced regulations that may or may not have much to do with highway safety. And while there may be some benefits to that some can tout, the downside of that was that prior to MCSAP, each state did their own thing on commercial vehicle enforcement, and you had state troopers and things like that would stop a truck if it needed to be stopped for some reason. They would check trucks if it needed to be checked for some reason, but they weren't just say, hey, there's a truck, let's pull it over. Generally, they had to have a reason. And, in trucking was since routes were regulated back then, you'd have the same drivers generally running the same roads every day, and they would get to know the police officers, the state troopers, in all of the states that they went through, because they shared the road. They generally all had CB radios, so they would strike up friendly relationships. And ironically, the other byproduct of that is those relationships kind of evolved into situations where they helped each other. Um, I was reminded of not all that long ago about, going for those drivers that ran across the lower states from oftentimes it would be East Coast to West Coast drivers that ran on Interstate 10 and Interstate 40. And in some of those states, when it's nighttime, when it's night, it's a long ways to the next town. And if you happen to be a state trooper in those places, there might not be another cop around for 100 miles. So truckers and troopers kind of helped themselves. They were acquainted, and if one needed help, the others would respond. And for a cop, it's a great thing to have when you've got other people around, to kind of as your backup. And truckers played that role in so many instances. So, but MixApp kind of took a lot of that away. And, again, we keep looking for ways to bring some of that stuff back. But it's not really, it's easier said than done, but it does require vigilance. One of the things that comes with dedicated enforcement is not all enforcement is motivated by the right ideals. And probably maybe the best example that I could give that certainly many drivers can remember, can certainly relate to, is once upon a time the Tennessee Public Service Commission, and that was the Public Service Commission in Tennessee was the dedicated agency that did commercial vehicle enforcement. And Public Service Commission basically was an independent agency within the state, not really accountable to much of anyone. And for various reasons, actually it was a political, it was kind of a political issue. And trucks would be stopped and truck drivers would be stopped. And for, heavy-handed enforcement, and at one time, it was fairly common for a Tennessee Public Service Commission officer to engage in the practice of demanding to search the cab of the truck as part of a truck inspection. And they didn't call it a search per se, but the practice was, if they were going to check for exhaust leaks, they'd check for exhaust leaks by looking in the bunk now. And of course, every now and then I hear somebody sort of mention that rationale, but drivers had said, wait a minute, I'm not going to consent to a search. You might be handcuffed to a mirror. Either way, unless they did the search, you were going to nothing in your favor was going to happen. And we would have drivers that would say, no, I'm not going to consent to this. And they would be arrested, and they would be ticketed, and they would be taken to a local justice of the peace to pay the fine, and then back to the truck, and the cop would write another ticket if you didn't consent to the search. And again, it hadn't been all that long ago that I heard this phrase used, that the cop said, well, look, they'll run out of money long before we run out of ink. And obviously this was certainly an unfair practice to drivers. It had sort of been building over a number of years. I was driving in the 1970s myself, and the practice then was that my personal practice then was I would never go to sleep in a Tennessee rest area unless it was the very last one in the state and I could get all the way to the far end of the rest area, because I knew if I didn't, there would be a good chance when I woke up, there would be a public service commissioner inspector doing right there and basically would put me through that rigmarole. And regardless, and the unfortunate part of that is that, I certainly wasn't alone among drivers. Others were in that same situation, and it didn't really matter how tired you may get while you're running the roads. If you know that nothing good is going to happen from taking a break, going to sleep there, you're going to do just as I did, and that's push on. So it shouldn't be that way. It was. We took that issue very, very seriously because one, it was a serious issue, but two, we also realized at OOIDA that no one else would. There would be no one else in the country that would actually raise that as an issue and take it head on. And, I think about that now in that we only had 14,000 members when we sued the Public Service Commission in Tennessee over the manner that they chose to inspect trucks. 14,000. Guys, that's not very many. Now, when we sued the state, our issue was what we believed to be unconstitutional searches. What we discovered during the course of that whole experience that went on for a number of years is what we learned was that much of what the Public Service Commission in Tennessee was doing was all about generating revenue for the Public Service Commission and also revenue that could be used to influence elections. And the Public Service Commission, it was an independent agency where all those guys ran for office to keep their jobs. And of course, the Public Service Commission was also a big funder of other statewide elections. And of course, the Public Service Commission had also been used as a springboard to higher office in the state of Tennessee for a long time. I mean, commissioners would go on to become governor, commissioners would go on to become Congress people. And, I guess which is fine, except for the manner that they were using to carry on their business. So, we sued them after years in court. After years in court, we did ultimately prevail, and the Public Service Commission was their authority to do what they were doing was taken away by the state legislature, and it was a welcome victory, but a hard-fought victory. And of course, again, what existed then. What existed then was a system where if you simply paid, you didn't have any problem. We didn't know at the time, but most of the bigger carriers that operated in or through the state, they just paid. They were contributors, and they could go on and they would be unmolested. We knew that wouldn't be practical for small operators, so we stood up for them. And that is probably the biggest win in terms of personal privacy rights on the behalf of drivers that certainly we've had, and that that I'm going to say that has ever existed for the vast majority of truckers. On the legislative front, before the ICC was abolished, we were able to convince lawmakers in Washington that things like the leasing regulations and the lumping laws needed to stay on the books, even if the Public Service Commission or if the ICC went away. And we were able to convince lawmakers that they should, and that we were also convinced lawmakers that even if the government wasn't going to enforce those regulations, individuals should be able to through the courts. And I mention that now because the way agency regulations work is that what the law used to say, that if an agency has a regulation, it's up to the agency to enforce that regulation. And what we've observed is, in practicality, that simply doesn't happen. And I mean, it wasn't happening then. So we convinced Congress that individuals should be able to enforce those regulations themselves through a private right of action in the courts. And they went along. Now, that doesn't mean that enforcement is easy, but it does mean it's possible through the courts. And OOIDA through the years has engaged in lots and lots of lawsuits against various carriers and others over violating regulations. We have been successful in numerous states over fees that they were collecting illegally. At one time, OOIDA either had suits pending or were party to suits pending against over 30 states over unconstitutional fees that they levy on truckers. We don't see much of that today simply because state lawmakers know better, and it is pretty well established in law that you can't do that. I'm going to say that the biggest monetary reward that we're able to go back to truckers was in Alabama, that collected an illegal fee from trucks just passing through the state. After, years in court and lots of decisions and lots of appeals, we ended up getting over $60 million returned to truckers from those fees and that were illegally collected. And that's through our law firm that we use yet today in DC. And we do those things when they're needed, but also again there really aren't others that are going to stand up on behalf of small business and trucking and professional truckers. And that's our lot in life. That's what we do. And we do that now. Again, we still use the same established law firm in Washington, D.C. We also have, for the last 17 years, we've had a permanent office in Washington, D.C. with 4 people that basically talk to lawmakers and policymakers on an ongoing basis about things that happen with small business truckers, the importance of small business truckers. The vast majority of trucking is little guys. We deliver the goods, and if there's anything that's come out of this issue with the pandemic and the tremendous loss of life and things like that, the importance of truckers to everyday Americans has certainly been made crystal clear. Our folks aren't first responders, but they are those that supply every one of the first responders. And again, while certainly when store shelves are empty, you need a truck right now, but we make the point and the reality that without those trucks, virtually every store shelf is empty in 3 days. So again, while I hope we can get beyond the fatalities and the tremendous costs we're paying in terms of human life and things like that. But and we can do it, but we all have to do it by sticking together and working together and caring about others, perhaps even more than we care about ourselves. But I've probably rambled long enough. Are there any questions? Oh, crap. Oh, I should mention this.
Go ahead. We do have a couple of questions, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, okay, what we're working on right now, the issues that I should point out that are really, really key issues. One, the biggest problem that we see affecting the folks behind the wheel today are basically there is no value placed on a driver's time. It's to me, it's just really, really stunning that the truck driver population is the only population out there that wants more and more hours to work simply because driving is the only way they can make money and improve their lives. And you know, the unfortunate part of that is that, you know, driving is the easy part. The tough part, the biggest issue in driver turnover, in driver safety and driver compensation is the fact that that too often there's no value placed on a driver's time. And we want to change that. That is one of our goals, to get drivers' time recognized as value. And it's not that if drivers' time is recognized by others in the supply chain as value, they quit wasting it. And the quickest way to get somebody to quit wasting your time is to have it, because when it starts costing them some money, then they start figuring out how they can better spend their money. And wasting your time shouldn't be part of that. We want hours of service that basically allow drivers to know when it's best for them to drive. And that doesn't mean we want to see everybody driving 80 or 100 hours a week, but you're going to be, you have to be the person that knows best when it makes sense to drive. And the decisions that you make need to be based on the right reasons, and that's got to be safety, but of course we also provide a service. We have legislation that's introduced this year for the first time that's exclusive to dedicated truck parking. So, and it's HR, interesting bill number, HR 6104. Any old trucker certainly ought to be able to remember that fairly easily, but it'll be for the first time we have funding dedicated from Congress that simply says this has to be used for new parking. And we need certainly the situation we're right now has allowed us to bring that, the need for that, to expand the awareness of that among lawmakers and policymakers. But you know, you got to strike while the iron's hot, so we want to push that bill hard. Right now, Congress is working on a reauthorization of the next highway bill. And, you know, the highway bill is something that basically reauthorization is all about what do we spend money on. And when I say money, it's the fuel taxes that we all pay when we fuel our cars, we fuel our trucks. How do we allocate that? And basically, what can we do to improve the system? Lawmakers are actually working on a bill like that right now. There are opportunities in those kinds of bills to address many of the issues that sort of plague truckers, that can make life a little easier. We want to make the most of the opportunity that we have right now. Next item on our list right now is broker reform. It's a big deal. We're in a situation right now that's been brought on by economic circumstances. And of course, many drivers feel they are simply taken advantage of in the current regulatory environment, that when they load through brokers, access to information that could help them make better, more informed, more intelligent decisions. They don't get that access, even though it's required to be provided by existing regulations. These are regulations that not all in the industry comply with. And, you know, this is the one issue that has brought all those truckers to DC, focusing attention on the issues for truckers. Their horns caught the attention of the president, and there is an opportunity to have that issue looked at right now. And look, we might argue about what's in a regulation and the merit of it. Others don't give us as truckers an opportunity to pick and choose what we're going to comply with. So we need to talk about these issues, and certainly we need to all be working on these things together if we're going to get through it. And we're certainly encouraging the players to be straight up front and honest about how we move on from here and resolve the issues that too many truckers have, and the lack of integrity and transparency that currently exists. last item on our list here, by no means the last, just an indication that OOIDA has been around for, gosh, since 1973 now, a long, long time. We're in it. We're playing the long game. We support those entities within trucking that basically help each other. Certainly, our own program is Truckers for Troops, where every year, you know, at one time, the majority of OOIDA's members were all veterans. Now, that's not the case anymore, simply because not so many joined the military, but we have lots and lots of military that are involved in trucking. Every year, we have a program where we dedicate funding to making sure that we let the troops that are the troops that are deployed in areas know that we're thinking about them, and we do those things annually. We're also big participants in the St. Christopher Fund and the other programs that are good things for truckers. And we have our own scholarship program too for children and grandchildren of members that, you know, where they want to advance their education, and we want to do those things that can help. So we pitch in where we can. And again, let me shut up and take some questions before we run out of time.
All right, thanks, Todd. We do have a question from Danny. He asked, do you think there was a time in the past where there was a peak of optimism in trucking for truckers?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Do you think there was a time in the past where there was a peak of optimism in trucking for truckers?
Oh, well. Well, I'm going to say yes, but let me also qualify that comment. We're all people. We're all people in that we could get caught up in the exhilaration of the moment. I'd have to say that if you look, you don't have to look too far back at economic circumstances to recognize that 2018 was basically a time when you could really get excited about trucking because truckers were doing great. It certainly was boom economic times. Many were thinking about expanding. 2018 was a record year for truck sales, and the enthusiasm kind of got the better of quite a few, because so now we're kind of in the hangover part of that, where things didn't continue to be quite as rosy, and then bad economic news came along, and we are really, really in the bad hangover right now. So yeah, it's while I'd have to say that lots of things that people do, if you knew all that you should know before you proceed with something, you might not do it. But just because you don't know all that you might know shouldn't necessarily be the only deterrent to you, because sometimes you get into things and you try hard and you work hard and they have a way of working out. So we don't ever try to discourage anyone from doing anything, but we certainly do want truckers to approach situations and opportunities with the right amount of generally awareness anyway.
All right. We have about 5 minutes left. I don't know if anyone else has any questions. You can put them in the chat window or in the question and answer panel, or raise your hand as we have Mr. David. David, go. You did the wrong person. David, if you unmute yourself, you can go ahead.
Okay, like that?
Yep, and talk into your phone a little bit. You're a little hard to hear.
All right, how about now?
Good job.
Hello, Todd. This is David Schnautz. How you
doing?
Hey,
David.
Good deal. I'm the convention committee chairman. I just want to thank you so much for joining in on this session and making it happen. It's really great. I know it's a good benefit.
Well, I'm glad to. And listen, I've seen some of your stuff and I really like your rides.
Well, Louis was wanting to drive my truck in Springfield, and I told him he could, and now that didn't happen.
Well, like, you know, as I said earlier, he and I were both planning on coming over. So
Sure, exactly. Well, maybe the next time.
yeah.
Yeah. All right, sir. Well, I just want to thank you for helping us out.
Well, glad to, because, you know, when it comes to these kinds of things, man, it's just hard not to look at older equipment. And if you ever liked equipment, you know, even it's cool, even if it wouldn't be, I mean, you sort of forget about the bumpy rides and things like that.
Exactly. That's what I say. I don't know if I'd want to go back would be neat, and maybe to take a truck with you back. But there's a point in there where I don't want to go back too far, and I don't want to go forward too far in a truck. They just aren't.
Oh yeah, I'm with you there.
You betcha. Well, all right, sir. Thank you so much again.
All right, thank you, David. It looks like the Schnauz brothers are active today because Danny asked if you could kind of take us out on maybe a good trucker story that brings a smile to your face from your owner operator days.
Smile to her. Oh, for me, I guess I've never forgotten this, so it obviously was memorable. The very first mountain I ever drove a truck down was Black Mountain in North Carolina. And of course, you know, in those days, not many trucks had engine brakes or Jake brakes on them. And, you know, one of the first things I always wanted to do when I started was I like to talk to the old guys to hear what they'd have to say, but also they would share with you their experiences and how you did certain things. And certainly I never went to any formal school, but, you know, the old guys would tell you what you needed to do to safely go down mountains. And you didn't have to be a rocket scientist to know that, well, trucks will really, really, really speed up fast. And once they're going so fast, there's no stopping them. And so the first mountain I'm going down is Black Mountain in North Carolina. And I am, you know, certainly being overly careful. And I wasn't taking any chances. And lo and behold, before I got to the bottom, there was a runoff on Black Mountain. And before I got to that runoff, I'll be darned if I don't see a four-wheeler go flying by me with the smoke just rolling off his front axle. And here the dummy is, heated up his brakes enough to get him on fire. He ran in the runoff. That's the funniest experience I ever had in that particular situation. The closest to anything coming after that was, again, I'm early. My early days, I'm young and dumb, and I'm in Denver, Colorado, headed for Craig, Colorado, and they've got I-70 closed because the highway is so bad. So I thought, well, crap, the truck stop's full, and I thought, I'm not going to stay here. I'm not going to stay here. So I take off up 40, because 40 will take you to Craig, Colorado. So not knowing what the road might be like, I'm going up Berthoud Pass. And my first observation is, man, this truck sure isn't running very well. Not realizing just how steep things were. And then I get on there a little farther and suddenly it's all these switchbacks. There's nothing there but me and all these people driving cars, all these skiers. And I thought, one of us probably shouldn't be here. However, you know, you're way past the point of no return. So, so anyway, I did make it over the top of Berthoud Pass. Also went across Rabbit Ears too on the way out to Craig, Colorado. But I learned after that, you're better off sometimes to be a patient driver. And, you know, if the road's blocked, the road's shut down, it's probably for a good reason, and respect that. So anyway, my most interesting experiences in the mountains.
Gotcha. John actually had a question. How do you see the advent of autonomous trucks affecting your focus on, as an association?
You know, I don't know how many years we've been talking about autonomous trucks right for now, but I mean, it sort of seems like gobs and gobs and gobs of years. And of course, the motivation behind that primarily comes from the investor community that basically would market and put their technology on the trucks. And of course, you know, you'd be a fool to think that technology can't improve every aspect of our lives. You'd also be a fool if you believe that these folks are telling you everything you need to know to make an intelligent decision, because they don't. They're marketing. They tell you what their stuff will do. They don't tell you what it won't do. And the biggest frustration we have right now is that there really isn't a source that you can go to hear the other side. What are the shortcomings? And of course, we have total empathy for the people behind the wheel, in that if you're going to drive anything, whether you're a truck driver or for that matter, you're an airplane pilot, the technology that's on that equipment shouldn't be capable of killing you. And certainly, you know, unfortunately, we've seen that happen with some of the airplanes, and we think, certainly I think, that in time we'll see more and more stuff autonomous. Do I think that's going to happen anytime soon for commercial trucks? Not in any kind of big scale, simply because it's a whole lot more complicated to it. I mean, we're in a situation right now where we can't even get people in, can't even get people in DC to pony up money to fix potholes. Now, how are you going to actually have a highway system that's capable of having autonomous vehicles when, again, you don't even have the motivation to fix the potholes? So yeah, we'll see them someday, but it'll be a long way off.
Right. Well, thank you, Todd. I appreciate it. This has been a wonderful discussion, and seems like you have lots of stories to tell. So if you want to pop in on one of our trucking story times, you could.
Listen, I would love that, because I've listened to some great guys that talk about trucking long before me, and I'm so thrilled that you're capturing that for posterity. So thank you.
Our first one starts in about 30 minutes. So if you want to hop on there. I appreciate everybody being out today. Again, if you want to listen to some stories, or if you have stories to tell, hop on our trucking story time. Switch over to aths.org/convention and see all of the things we have to offer. Don't forget to check out the virtual truck show. We have lots of people who've been checking those out today. And we will see everyone at our next webinar at 3 o'clock. Bye.
Bye-bye.